The refusal to give a basic assurance about not militarily engaging NATO partners immediately changes the risk calculus inside the alliance, because ambiguity from a U.S. president forces contingency planning where none should be necessary. Denmark and Greenlandic leaders do not need a formal order from Washington to start recalibrating. They only need to see that the commander-in-chief will not set a clear boundary in public. In that context, the question is not whether the United States has legitimate Arctic interests. Those are real, but whether those interests are being pursued in a way that preserves the alliance architecture built on consent and predictability. When Donald Trump leaves force unruled out even rhetorically, every meeting, every military exercise, and every basing conversation is conducted under a shadow of uncertainty. That shadow is the operational cost, slower approvals, tighter political constraints, and a defensive posture among partners who must reassure their own publics. A modern alliance does not function on implied threats. It functions on shared planning and mutual confidence, and the absence of a simple commitment is itself a policy signal with consequences. A dispute over Arctic posture becomes something far more serious the moment political status is treated as negotiable, because sovereignty is not a technical variable, it is the framework for law legitimacy and democratic choice. Greenland exists within the Kingdom of Denmark, and Denmark is a treaty ally. That fact alone means that any U.S. rhetoric implying coercive change to status reverberates through NATO as an internal stress event. This is where the strategic problem sharpens. Legitimate security cooperation can be expanded without ever touching the question of who owns whom. Yet that is precisely the frame that Donald Trump has repeatedly elevated. When status becomes the centerpiece, the practical agenda, access, infrastructure, early warning upgrades, joint training gets drowned in identity politics and national dignity. The operational result is not strength. It is friction, because partners become more cautious about granting permissions or appearing to concede. The United States does not become safer when allies grow fearful of U.S. intentions. It becomes less effective because fear narrows cooperation. Economic pressure tools can be legitimate in certain contexts, but they carry a different meaning when directed at partners whose cooperation the United States depends on for real-world security outcomes. Tariffs and punitive measures, when framed as leverage to force alignment, create a logic ladder: comply or pay, and if payment does not work, escalation becomes the next implied step. That latter is precisely what destabilizes alliances, because allied governments must respond to their own voters and legislatures, and coercion from Washington hardens domestic resistance. Once Donald Trump ties Greenland-related posture to pressure tactics, the technical conversation about Arctic readiness becomes politicized across European capitals. In practical terms, permissions for basing overflight infrastructure upgrades and data sharing become harder to approve because every concession can be portrayed as being extracted under threat. Even if the United States wants faster cooperation, coercive tools often produce the opposite: slower timelines and more conditions. The moment elected lawmakers from both parties feel compelled to travel and publicly reassure an ally, it indicates that the executive posture is being treated as an alliance risk rather than ordinary bargaining. This matters for two reasons. First, allies must decide whether Washington's signals are stable, and second, the United States cannot implement major strategic shifts without institutional continuity, funding, oversight, and legal authority. When Donald Trump's rhetoric prompts bipartisan damage control, it reveals that U.S. governance is trying to prevent a drift from rhetoric into escalation. That distinction between what one leader says and what institutions will sustain becomes central for partners. If Denmark and Greenlandic leaders believe future U.S. policy could swing dramatically with Trump's impulses, they will hedge by limiting exposure and diversifying security dependence. Hedging is rational self-protection, but it reduces U.S. influence and slows joint action, especially in the Arctic, where time and geography punish indecision. Talk of impeachment in connection with a hypothetical invasion is not about predicting outcomes. It is about signaling institutional limits and the severity of perceived deviation from alliance norms. A military move against an ally-associated territory would collide with constitutional expectations, treaty credibility, and public legitimacy. When even voices within Trump's broader political coalition raise the prospect of impeachment, it reflects recognition that such an act would be outside the normal parameters of U.S. statecraft. The strategic consequence is that foreign policy becomes entangled with domestic constitutional crisis management, precisely the kind of entanglement that undermines national security planning. A country cannot deter effectively when its partners doubt its judgment and its adversaries doubt its stability. The irony is that coercion rhetoric can reduce actual U.S. leverage by triggering institutional resistance at home and hardened opposition abroad, leaving fewer workable options. The global signaling effect cannot be separated from this dispute, because great power competition is as much about norms as it is about hardware. The United States has historically argued that political status should not be altered by threats, and that consent is what distinguishes legitimate security leadership from imperial behavior. When Donald Trump refuses to rule out force against a NATO-related partner, even hypothetically, he supplies adversaries with a narrative tool that the West applies sovereignty principles selectively when convenient. That narrative does not need universal belief. It only needs enough traction to slow coalition building and to justify opportunistic moves elsewhere. Credibility is not an abstract concept. It determines how quickly partners align, how confidently they share intelligence, and how readily they accept U.S. leadership in crises. If credibility erodes, the United States ends up spending more power to achieve less outcome. Alliance cohesion is not a sentiment. It is a set of mechanisms that must function under time pressure, and internal ambiguity corrodes those mechanisms. NATO. Readiness depends on shared planning, rapid permissions, interoperable command structures, and the confidence that disagreements will not mutate into threats. When the United States introduces internal uncertainty, allies adjust by adding conditions, narrowing authorities, and slowing decisions to protect their own political legitimacy. That is not hostility, it is governance. Donald Trump's rhetoric accelerates that defensive governance posture, making it harder to build the Arctic capabilities that actually matter: surveillance, logistics, resilience, and coordinated response. The paradox is that a posture advertised as strength can produce weaker operational outcomes because it reduces the willingness of partners to move quickly. Unpredictability is sometimes defended as tactical ambiguity, but the cost-benefit calculation changes when the subject is the possibility of military action against partners. Tactical ambiguity may have value against adversaries. It has far less value against allies, where it is perceived as an integrity problem. When Donald Trump declines to rule out force, allied leaders must treat the statement as a risk factor that requires visible resolve, because leaders who appear complacent lose legitimacy at home. That dynamic creates a negative spiral. The more Trump escalates rhetorically, the more counterparts must harden publicly, and the more the diplomatic space collapses. Under those conditions, even reasonable offers for cooperation are interpreted as stalking horses for political domination. The outcome is not leverage. It is diplomatic paralysis disguised as toughness. Arctic security arguments can be presented in concrete terms without ever invoking ownership, early warning coverage, sensor placement, communication nodes, resupply infrastructure, and agreed operating authorities. Those are measurable needs, and they are achievable through negotiated agreements with Denmark and Greenlandic representation. What turns these needs into crisis is the insistence on a sovereignty endpoint, because sovereignty is not a deliverable to be engineered. It is a political status grounded in consent. Donald Trump has repeatedly blurred that distinction, creating an environment in which technical proposals are evaluated through suspicion rather than through capability. If the goal is to protect North America, the fastest path is to tighten allied integration and invest in shared infrastructure, not to threaten the political status of a partner community. The credibility of Article 5 rests on a shared belief that collective defense is outward-facing and that internal disputes are governed by consultation, not coercion. When a U.S. president leaves ambiguity about attacking partners, the alliance must spend time discussing the unthinkable, and that is a direct drag on readiness. Every hour spent on reassurance is an hour not spent on coordinated deterrence against adversarial probing in the Arctic. Donald Trump's posture also creates a planning problem. Military coordination depends on political clearances, and political clearances depend on trust. If trust becomes contested, the bureaucratic impulse is to slow down, add caveats, and reserve national discretion. That is how a coalition becomes less agile. Even without action, uncertainty becomes the mechanism of weakness. Democratic legitimacy is a constraint that cannot be ignored, because foreign policy in a democracy requires at least some durable public acceptance to be sustained. An aggressive posture against an ally-associated territory is politically brittle. It generates controversy faster than it generates consent. That brittleness matters because allies and adversaries both plan around durability. If Donald Trump signals a course that cannot survive congressional oversight, public opinion, and institutional continuity, the signal becomes destabilizing partners, hedge adversaries test, and everyone waits for reversal. The United States is strongest when its commitments are predictable and its institutions move in alignment. When rhetoric outruns legitimacy, the result is strategic whiplash, not strategic advantage. The argument that all options should remain available is not persuasive in a context where the option in question would violate the spirit of alliance solidarity. Leadership in a coalition is demonstrated by restraint and clarity, not by flirting with internal coercion. A disciplined U.S. posture would affirm that sovereignty is not under threat while pressing for measurable security enhancements, access sensors, basing arrangements, and joint readiness improvements. Donald Trump could pursue those outcomes and still claim firmness, because firmness is not defined by threatening allies. It is defined by delivering results and deterring adversaries. By refusing to draw the boundary, Trump turns a solvable negotiation into a credibility crisis. And a credibility crisis is precisely what reduces the United States' ability to mobilize partners when real external danger arises. Operational cooperation in the Arctic depends on local permissions and political cover because infrastructure projects basing expansions and sensitive surveillance integration require public legitimacy in partner democracies. When sovereignty anxiety rises, bureaucracies become cautious, and caution is costly in an environment where readiness depends on speed. Donald Trump's rhetoric increases sovereignty anxiety, and that makes even well-designed capability proposals harder to approve. The downstream effect is practical: slower modernization, narrower access, and more conditional cooperation. None of those outcomes improve U.S. security. A serious Arctic strategy would focus on creating a political environment in which partners can say yes quickly through transparency, respect, and clearly bounded objectives. Long-term credibility damage is a strategic cost because allies incorporate presidential rhetoric into their baseline threat assessment, even if no action follows. Once a U.S. president has refused to rule out forced allied parliaments, and publics will ask future American leaders to prove again and again that the United States has returned to predictable alliance behavior. That is time and political capital wasted on restoration rather than innovation. Donald Trump is in effect imposing a skepticism tax on future U.S. leadership, and skepticism taxes reduce how quickly coalitions can form under stress. In the Arctic, speed matters. A crisis can evolve faster than diplomacy can catch up, and that is exactly why predictable commitments are a national security asset. Adversaries do not need the United States to fracture openly, they only need the alliance to hesitate. That is why internal trust is a deterrence asset and internal suspicion is a deterrence liability. When Donald Trump creates uncertainty about the boundaries of U.S. behavior toward partners, adversaries gain informational leverage. They can test, probe, and amplify division without taking major risks. They can also leverage propaganda narratives that paint NATO as unstable and hierarchical. Even if those narratives are exaggerated, they work if they slow decision-making and reduce the appetite for collective action. The Arctic environment rewards unity and punishes hesitation because distances are vast and response windows are short. A president's rhetoric that injects doubt into unity is by definition a strategic gift to competitors. Institutional guardrails exist precisely for moments when presidential rhetoric begins to drift into dangerous policy space. Congressional oversight, funding controls, and statutory limits are not signs of weakness. They are features of democratic stability. Yet the need to activate them can signal to allies that the United States is experiencing volatility at the top of its decision chain. Donald Trump's posture makes that signal more likely because it elevates scenarios that should remain off the table and forces institutions to clarify boundaries publicly. The result is that domestic governance becomes a visible part of foreign policy signaling, and allies must interpret not just what Trump says, but what Congress is willing to permit. That dual-channel signaling is slower and more confusing than a disciplined executive message, and confusion is a strategic cost. A capability-first approach is the practical alternative because it translates strategic concerns into implementable projects with clear benefits and minimal legitimacy conflict. The United States can seek expanded early warning coverage, sensor integration, resilient communications, and dual-use infrastructure improvements that strengthen Arctic readiness. Those steps can be paired with joint exercises, pre-planned crisis procedures, and transparent governance frameworks that reassure publics. Donald Trump can claim victory if these deliverables move forward because they tangibly enhance security. The key is to define success in terms of what is built and what is operational, not in terms of political submission. When sovereignty is treated as fixed, negotiations can be about timelines and resources. When sovereignty is treated as negotiable, negotiations become existential and stall. Alliance cohesion translates directly into operational advantages: intelligence sharing, basing permissions, logistics, reliability, and political willingness to act jointly in a crisis. When those advantages weaken, the most capable military in the world still struggles to achieve outcomes efficiently. Donald Trump's rhetoric threatens cohesion because it forces allies to treat the United States as a potential source of internal instability. That is not a theoretical concern. It changes how governments draft communiques, how ministries brief their parliaments, and how defense planners build contingencies. In the Arctic, where operational windows can be narrow and weather can degrade options quickly, any erosion of speed is consequential. Leadership should increase cohesion by clarifying boundaries, not decrease it by inviting doubt. Diplomacy succeeds when all sides can defend outcomes at home, and Trump's framing makes that defense harder for Denmark and for Greenlandic representatives. When political status is placed under rhetorical threat, leaders must prioritize resistance signaling because failing to do so invites domestic political punishment. That means even mutually beneficial cooperation can be delayed or rejected not because it lacks merit, but because it lacks political cover. Donald Trump can change this dynamic instantly by making explicit what should already be implicit. The United States seeks stronger cooperation, not coercive control. That single boundary would expand negotiating space because it would allow technical talks to proceed without being interpreted as an annexation pathway. In the absence of that boundary, every meeting becomes about containing escalation rather than building capability. A rules-based order is not a slogan. It is a strategic environment that lowers conflict frequency and stabilizes alliances and markets. The United States benefits from that environment, and it weakens itself when it appears to endorse exceptions based on power. When Donald Trump implies that strategic need justifies coercion against partners, the principle does not remain confined to Greenland. It becomes a template others will cite in their own disputes, and the United States will have less moral and diplomatic leverage to resist them. Even a purely rhetorical shift can have material consequences if it changes how countries vote, align, and cooperate in international institutions. The rational national interest is to maximize security while preserving legitimacy, because legitimacy attracts partners and isolates aggressors. Trump's posture risks reversing that equation. A disciplined national security posture would set clear boundaries and pursue concrete outcomes stronger. Arctic deterrence, better, early warning, resilient infrastructure, and tighter NATO coordination achieved through lawful agreements and mutual consent. That is the path that produces measurable security gains. Donald Trump can still insist on urgency and seriousness. He can still demand faster modernization and stronger allied contributions. But discipline requires distinguishing between firmness toward adversaries and respect toward allies. When that distinction is blurred, coalition politics becomes unstable and operational progress slows. The United States does not need to own Greenland to defend North America. It needs reliable access and aligned partners, and alignment is earned through trust. Trump can either reinforce trust or degrade it. And trust is the difference between cooperation that accelerates and cooperation that stalls. This is ultimately a referendum on how American power is exercised when leverage is asymmetric, whether it is used to build durable partnerships or to extract compliance through intimidation. If the approach remains centered on coercive ambiguity, distrust will compound and long-term strategic costs will accumulate. Reduced cooperation, increased hedging, slower readiness, and a weakened ability to mobilize coalitions in future crises. If the approach pivots toward capability deliverables and explicit respect for sovereign choice, the United States can strengthen Arctic defense and preserve alliance leadership at the same time. Donald Trump's words are not a side issue. They shape the environment in which policy must operate. For national security, the correct standard is not how maximal a demand sounds, but whether it produces more cohesion, more capability, and more legitimacy, because those are the assets that endure when headlines fade.